Ever since the Cadbury report in 1991, the topic of corporate governance has been high on the agenda of enterprises. In light of recent scandals, particularly in the private side, there are still a lot of unanswered questions. Is too much regulation really the answer? Why are banks singled out on cultural issues? What do we mean by changing the corporate culture? These and many other questions are what we asked some of the panelists at the recent Said Business School Forum, where we addressed corporate governance in the finance sector. What should a sustainable organizational culture look like in the finance sector, and how can this be managed?
The world has changed a lot in financial services in the last decade, especially since the financial crisis. I think today you really need an organization that's more flexible and nimble, but at the same time one that is governed very clearly by an effective board of directors. So flexibility, nimbleness all matter, just because of the competitive nature of the industry. The landscape has changed completely in the last decade or so. But at the same time you need proper governance top down so that you don't have people doing things they're not supposed to be doing.
I think the finance sector faces similar challenges to actually the broader corporate environment, which is that the pressures that boards face today are so much greater and they happen with so much greater speed when it comes to the way in which a board interacts with the organisation that it leads. So I think the biggest challenge for the finance sector is dealing with the traditional other stakeholders that they've not necessarily had to deal with as much. And by that, in the finance sector, of course, the biggest problem for them has been how to deal with the very fast changing public mood and political stakeholders.
Moving to the broader landscape, what are going to be most crucial new challenges emerging for the corporate governance of organizations into 2017, and the effects this will have on corporate reputation?
Organizations have always faced enormous risks, but the nature of those risks is changing as people outside of the corporate sector start to worry more and more about problems of executive pay, of corporate behavior and that sort of thing, in ways that they haven't really worried about in the past. So organizations in the future will need to build governance systems that allow them to engage with external parties as well as with internal parties, and to think in a joined up way about internal-external relationships. And the biggest challenge for corporate governance is going to be creating structures that allow that to happen and staffing boards in a way that can accomplish that. And if they don't get that right, companies will start to experience reputational damage within constituencies that perhaps they worried about less in the past than they're going to have to worry about in the future.
The risks are greater because of technology. The risks are greater because of competition, which is a consequence of technology. And so if you're a board member or involved in the corporate governance aspect of the corporation, you have a difficult job, because you've got to balance your corporate governance responsibilities with the effectiveness of the organization. So the tension between the effectiveness and the governance becomes much tougher to manage.
Well, I think we would prefer to look at the opportunities just than looking at risks. We think there's been a lot of cleanup, in the basic asset structure in financial services since 2008. And what we see, and you can see this in the improving trust scores, since that period of time, if you look, for example, at the Edelman barometers, is that trust is now higher in financial services than it was back in 2012, significantly higher. And that appears to be driven by two things. One is purpose, and the other is technology. And technology, as it shifts towards mobile, towards automated platforms, those are more trusted by consumers than old-style, financial advisory, for example. So by tilting their technology towards mobile internet kind of solutions, banks, unwittingly in many cases, are also enhancing the social contract with consumers and with society.
How should senior executives and boards most effectively plan to meet these challenges?
Well, I think good boards are made up of a very diverse group of people. And one of the things that I think remains a big problem is that the group of people who are currently the main board directors of the major companies tend to be drawn from a pretty similar small pool of people. To get real diversity is not about colour, it's not about the gender of the individual or indeed their faith. It's really about their thinking. It's about coming with a different set of thoughts. into the boardroom. And if the same set of people, they may be different gender, they may have different colours of skin, they may be different faiths, but if they all eat in the same restaurants, go to the same operas, then actually they're going to come with the same set of opinions about governance. And I think that good boards need to look very hard at whether they've got true diversity represented in their members.
Invest more money, allow for investment in areas which require it, because CFOs tend to be much more tight with capital spending than they should be at a time like this, partly because they can't see the returns on the potential investment, but you have to take a bit of a chance. So CFOs need to open their pocketbooks a bit more than usual, just to ensure that companies are ready to face these challenges. On the other hand, they must also educate the boards to make them understand that these challenges are unique, that the playing fields change permanently, and that the investments they're making are for the good of the company.
The biggest difficulty they face if they're to meet those challenges is staffing the board in the right way. So if we continue to staff the board entirely with people who come up through the corporate sector, then of course the problem-solving ability of the board and the ability to advise on corporate policy will be very high. But its ability to deal with external facing problems may be somewhat smaller, and it's important therefore that boards are genuinely diverse and that they include people who understand how the governmental organisations and other external parties operate and what they're concerned with.
The key role that a CFO can play is to say, okay, so that's my social purpose. For example, it might be to revitalise the housing market in a country. It might be to drive enterprise and innovation. It might be to improve diversity. The key thing that the CFO can say is, right, that's the purpose. Let's turn that into a set of numbers and metrics which we can track in the organization with the same rigor that you do revenues, costs, risk metrics, and so on. Start turning those into things that you can measure and track. How much has my diversity improved? Is it 5%, 10%, 40%? How much is my impact on enterprise improved? How many new businesses and so on? So the CFO can be the guardian of those numbers and therefore really be the judge of the improvement in the performance.
How do senior executives prepare or plan to influence their boards towards corporate governance best practice?
Well, getting to the point where we have a sufficiently diverse board and it's able to think in a particularly holistic way about the challenges it faces will require a broad range of people, and that's not going to happen overnight. Boards need to plan succession planning to make sure that they have the right sort of people in the future, and some of those people will require training because they haven't had a great deal of close involvement with the corporate sector. And boards need to think therefore both about succession and about training the right people when they find them.
Well, there's a lot of external reference points. The really interesting thing about governance is that you've got multiple models around the world, you've got best practice around the world, and you've certainly got a lot of worst practice around the world. Boards need to be very outward looking and need to then use the intelligence they get from the best of what they see and to avoid, of course, the worst of what they see.
Post-financial crisis, banks needed to restore their reputation. But there is still a lot to be done in order to change their culture and prevent any reputational damage in the future. There seems to be some momentum when it comes to driving the corporate governance agenda, and if you're still looking for some answers, this forum is definitely a place to find them.